Morning, good afternoon. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to our Disconnected Leaders and Employees session that Greg Leskew and I are going to host with you today. Looking forward to the interesting conversation we're going to have, and we're going to kick it off with a few minutes, probably about 10 minutes, of some of the research insights that we've gathered over the last couple of years. And then we'll get in some interesting dialogues and conversation around the disconnect. So a little bit about me, and I'll turn it over to Greg, as I'm the SVP of Customer Experience for LHH, and I lead the Sales and Customer Experience team here in Canada, with a huge passion for career development and the impact on organizations and individuals. So looking forward to the conversation today. Greg?
Yeah, thank you, Kim, and great to see you all here. I'm a SVP in our learning and development area. I've been with LHH for about 3 years, but working in talent development for just over 20 years. My experience really cuts across the full employee life cycle, right from recruitment and selection into growing talent and designing programs for clients to help them grow the people and improve their state of readiness. I do a lot in executive assessments, and now I'm leading our coaching practice across North America. So great to be with you today.
So we're going to kick it off with a little bit around some of our research that's been most recently done. Specifically, our parent company, Adecco, did some research in kind of early 2020, just as the pandemic began. It's a global survey around the new world of work and attitudes towards work. And then they did the research again mid 2021 to see what has changed, kind of early stages of the pandemic. Then people were full blown into it, and now we're looking to see what's going to come out of this what we would call post-pandemic world. So some interesting attitudes and changes really were reflected in the research. I think 15,000 people were surveyed globally, and really interesting to see. Just a little bit of a snapshot. Canada had probably the second worst scores in terms of dissatisfaction around the world of work and career development and that disconnect. Japan being number one. And US was way down the way in terms of they had a big, stronger reaction or positive reaction to the world of work. So we'll dig into that a little bit. But I think what's really important as we go through this research is to think about how attitudes have changed and what's really important to people as we move forward. And I think one of the big assumptions that often are made in the organizations, which our research will show, is we often try to think one size will fit all, whether you're a younger, older generation, whatever generation you're in, and that we all need kind of the same things out of our world of work, which we know is really not true. And all of you can probably attest to that situation. So let's dig into the research a little bit, Greg. So we're going to kick off a little bit around overarching emerging trends that came out of this. And we'll link this back to leadership and career disconnect in a minute. But if you think about some of the items that are happening out there and some of the trends, kind of the mismatch of skills of what we need for the future versus what people have or think they have, trying to make sure we're really recruiting a diverse global talent pool with the ability to work more hybrid or remote. That means no longer within your country or city or province or state. And then how do we make sure our leaders are ready to lead this group of folks and really ensure, we used to think about making sure you have a job, but employability means you've got the right skills for the right role in the right organization and creating a culture. And again, this comes back to the disconnect around lifelong learning. So we're going to dig into this more as we think about how are these elements all connected to the leadership and the career disconnect. So I'm going to kick it off with getting into a little bit of stats, just a little bit of stats. Greg, you want to move us to the next slide? So one of the things as we hear people talk about the great disconnect, the great reflection, the great resignation, I think what comes down to the overall view is people have a huge appetite for career development, and they're looking for organizations to actually provide that for them. So I think part of their challenge is organizations aren't necessarily delivering what employees want, but part of that is employees don't actually know what they need. So I think what this really speaks to is that disconnect around expectations of what employees want of their employer and disconnect what's actually being delivered. So that's really important to think about how does that disconnect play out and what does that look like within organization? And what is the implication on leadership? What is the implication on employees around that piece? But really, really looking at it from a radically different perspective, as you can see by what individuals think versus what organizations are actually delivering on. So managers aren't taking the time for career development. So this is an interesting stat. If you think of it in the context, if leaders aren't looking after themselves and developing themselves, they're also not taking the time to develop other people. So I think it's interesting to think about 68%. That's a huge amount. Managers believe leadership training is really important, but only 20% are participating in that. Why? They don't take the time. They don't see they have the time. They don't think it's their priority, or the culture doesn't really support development. So if you think about your own organization, what does leadership development look like? Is there opportunity? What does career development look like? How has career development been defined? Is there opportunities to reskill and upskill? I think every organization, and especially all the HR professionals on this call, know that the goal to filling some of those skills gaps is by upskilling, reskilling, and redeploying people. But how come it's not happening? I'll turn this over. And what we're really going to take a deeper dive into, that Greg's going to take over, is a little bit around the disconnect between what leaders see and the individuals see in some of the research data. Over to you, Greg. We lost you, Greg? Greg? Did we lose Greg? Okay, I've lost Greg on you, so I'm going to take over the slides. So let's just take over the slides, and I'll take over the session. Not sure what happened to Greg, but we'll keep going. So this is a little bit around the research that comes out in the context of a senior leader perspective versus a manager's perspective. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but if you think about the gap, senior leaders have actually felt that they are giving clear direction on training. They're providing the development, they're giving the opportunity. But if you look at the skills around individual non-managers, so these are individual contributors, what their view is around future-proofing the workforce, very different perspectives about what's actually being done and perceived to being done versus what the expectations are. And this goes back to when we think about the expectations as an organization, we sometimes make assumptions what individuals want versus what individuals are actually getting in return. So it's really important to take a look at that. So I'm just responding. There's a Q&A here. I'm just taking a look. Will we be getting a deck? I did forgot to share with people. We will be sharing the recording, and we'll come back to you with recording at the end of the session. So stay tuned. So as we look through this research data, really thinking about what's the implication in organizations if senior leaders think they're delivering on reskilling, upskilling, and assessing staff, but employees are not. And so it's really interesting to say, what are those implications as we struggle to make that connection? Where does that go? What really happens on that disconnect? And what are we really doing to address that from a leader perspective? And it comes back to, and I'm going to turn it over and have a little bit of a poll here to get some insights from you individuals around that disconnect, but really seeing if senior leaders think they're delivering on it, who are they asking? How are they having those conversations, and how are we going to break that disconnect? So I'm going to turn this over, and we're going to have a little bit of a poll here and see where we're getting your responses to this actual poll. And by then, maybe Greg has joined us again, but he lost connection on his internet. So stay tuned. So Laura, if you want to launch this poll and get some feedback from our participants, that would be great. So What is the percentage of skills gap perception in your organization between employees, and leaders? So pick one choice on that, and we'll see where the poll takes us. So Laura, if you want to run that poll, let's see if we get it. Ah, Greg came back. He's alive and well. The joys of technology.
The joys of tech. So sorry about that.
That's okay. So Laura, if you can launch the poll, that would be great. Oops. We're not seeing the results on the screen. Oh, here they come. So let's see if the poll is completed. Right now we have 7% voted between 0 and 20%. 45% voted for 21 to 40%. 41% said 41 to 60%. And only 8% thought 61 to 80%. So everybody's kind of mostly in the range of 21 to 60%. So how does that compare to our research, Greg?
Yeah, it fits right in with what we thought, like the delta that we saw on the last slide, which is a little surprising when you think about, especially in areas of the strategy side of things, giving resources to people and making sure that they have opportunities to be assessed and upskilled, that if there's a 50% gap, that's massive. And that's what we're seeing here as well. And there are a few things that would likely come up because of that. It's difficult for organizations to meet the challenges of tomorrow if they think they're at a certain place, they think they're at a high watermark, and they're just not there. So it can be very difficult. Why don't we go on and we'll maybe talk a little bit about the disconnect itself on the next slide. And thank you for running that, Laura. So the root cause of this disconnect. So we talked about the delta and why it's there. The pandemic likely had an impact on that. It might not have been as large, but certainly would still be there. And as we move into the new world of work where things are more hybrid, it's likely to still remain a challenge. But the root cause really comes from a disconnect or lack of communications on topics that truly matter to employees. This is especially true when it comes to development planning and career pathing. And generally speaking, leaders just lack the effectiveness of coaching and giving feedback and those skill sets which are needed to address the disconnect. Again, it's something that it's present now in the situation that we're in with the pandemic. It's likely to improve a little bit, but those skills will still need to be stretched and grown. And there are some steps that can be taken that organizations can use to close the gap. And a lot of it, if you go on to the next slide, Kim, a lot of it has to do with how do you enhance those connections? How do you make sure that delta gets closed? So the first is building psychological safety is a pretty important one. We've heard a lot of this over the last couple of years in particular, but it's one of the main drivers is creating a space where open two-way conversations or communication can flow, and creating forums and a culture where employees can share their thoughts candidly, and leaders work to amplify diverse voices across the organization. We've heard a lot about from companies doing things like town halls, agenda-free meetings, opportunities where people can engage with their peers even through virtual means like we're doing today. And these are ways to start to enhance those connection points. The next one is around practicing inspirational leadership. Again, something that was very important that came up over the past couple of years. Leaders who tend to communicate transparently and regularly make connections between employees' responsibilities, their career aspirations, their motivations, and where the corporate strategy or where the organization needs them to go. They share that North Star so people can kind of see off in the distance the path that they can tack towards. I'll share a quick example or analogy just to highlight that, which I share often, which is if you have a person who's, let's say they're doing restoration on a historical building, and you've got a person who's laying bricks and they're working on this project for, a year or two, and every day they're out there laying bricks and mortar, it can be a little bit deflating because it's more monotonous work. But if the designer, the architect takes the time to show the person laying the bricks, this is the archway that you're going to be building that leads into a courtyard that draws your eye up into this area of this building. Those kind of things are the things that inspire people. They start to feel like they're working towards something that's bigger than themselves, and they can see that end result. So you can see the parallels between how that can work in a business setting and the story I just shared. Next is scheduling informal meetings, something that was sorely lacking over the last couple of years. One of the challenges we heard repeatedly was that there was just a lack of informal meetings. Some of those water cooler discussions or drop-in meetings, and particularly important for leaders who had that kind of style of walking around, became even more difficult for them. These are especially important when it comes to areas like process improvement and innovation, because those generally percolate up from within an organization, and they take root through those means of those informal meetings. So cultivating networks, building relationships, and ensuring there's strong collaboration, and leaders and organizations can encourage more of those informal meetings. I shared an example earlier about like an agenda-free meeting or a coffee chat, where some of those conversations can take place more in a dynamic environment. And second from last year is creating a culture of multi-directional feedback. This is always a sore spot for organizations. Anytime you look at the leadership behaviors, where there's strengths and where there's gaps, things like coaching and feedback are always in the top three. So the opportunity here is, if you can create a feedback culture and flex that muscle within the organization, it means you're able to discuss sensitive topics in a way that's very respectful and constructive, and it's a catalyst for growth. It starts to create deeper connections with people. It's estimated that Gen Zs are going to make up 38% of the workforce by the end of this calendar year. And one of the things that's a top work preference from that group is that they get regular and value-driven feedback from their leaders. And I would throw in that they've also mentioned professional development, or being grown or developed, is also in their top three. But really important that feedback is a key mechanism and a catalyst for growth. And finally, boosting a leader's ability to conduct meaningful development planning and conversations, very key. And this is heavily linked to the point above about that culture of multi-directional feedback. When it comes to development conversations, leaders need to have comfort in discussing a person's strengths and development areas in equal measure, especially when they're talking about where they sit and maybe where they want to go from a career standpoint. Things like training or workshops in development planning and how to have valuable career conversations, very critical. And if anyone's ever conducted an audit on development plans and how those career conversations go, generally they come back fairly thin, and they're not as robust as you would like, or if they're happening at all. It's a real struggle in a lot of organizations. And so I'll share an example of an organization I worked with a year and some ago on doing exactly this. This was a large multinational utility organization where leaders were struggling to have more of these impactful development and career conversations. They tend to be more of like a directive kind of style. I'm the leader, so I'll tell you what to do, with a focus really on a person's responsibilities and where they were in the organization. And so this company wanted to build a foundation around coaching and feedback, and make sure that people shifted their mindsets away from that directive style and more towards asking open-ended, powerful questions. And they wanted to sharpen people's tools in that area. So they held a series of workshops and peer coaching sessions where they talked about how do you broach those topics? What are some of the models that you can use around development planning and career conversations? And what it did is it built the confidence of those leaders to have those conversations. They also got employees to zero in on high value development priorities. So things that would really help them, the things that they were doing in role that would help lead them to something else, whatever that happened to be within the organization. So to grow towards something. And again, using powerful questions to attain those means. And I think one of the keys with that, because it takes a while to do these types of things, is they set up, they were thinking about sustainability throughout. They said, this is going to be a long process. So we need to have progress measures along the way to highlight opportunities for further growth. They wanted these conversations to happen more regularly across a year instead of at that annual performance management timeframe. And so instead of adding additional time into their calendar year, they said, let's carve out time at some of our already pre-existing meetings that are one-to-one where we can have some of those really helpful conversations. So this is still a work in progress. The organization has definitely moved the needle, or leaders have reported that over the years, they didn't feel like they had the skill sets to be able to have these conversations and spark growth and develop talent in their teams, but now they're feeling more confident about having those, and they're happening more frequently.
So Greg, I just wanted to add in something I think it's really important that I've experienced and seen it happen in organization is really the concept of separating development conversations and where your strengths and weaknesses are from a career conversation. And I'll use the example, often employee engagement surveys, your ability to have career conversations develop you are often one of the top 3 drivers of engagement, but often it's the last 2 or 3 questions of any performance review. So how you doing, Greg? What do you want to do with your career? Okay, great, thanks, goodbye. So only thing people remember is what are you not doing well and what do you got to work on versus what are you actually doing to hear me about my career goals? So the challenge I would have with most organizations is make sure you separate a performance conversation from a career development conversation so people feel heard, people feel like you're concerned about where they want to take their career, and you're really understanding what motivates and drives them. So just a little caveat to that is making sure you separate those, because often what I've done, I've worked with organizations when you ask them, does your manager have a career conversation with you? People will say no. And the manager will say, well, of course I did. I asked them what they want to do with their career. It was a 30-second conversation at the end of their performance review. So I'd encourage people to think about separating those 2 conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point, Kim. And, a good reason to separate them is one is a retrospective, right? When you're talking about performance, you're looking in the rearview mirror, whereas the other is future facing. You want to make sure that those are both meaningful conversations so that people can feel like they can move forward towards something. In that, I think culture does play a big role in that. And culture is it's difficult to design and to manage, especially for organizations that are looking to create a culture of talent development and career planning where it has a home there. And there are a few things that can be done from a culture side. First, maybe we just talk a little bit about the elements of culture. Kim, if you want to flip over to the next slide. And culture lives in several areas in an organization, but it mainly lives in the how side. You can see it if you look at this model that I'm showing in the top left, in the vision and mission, there are elements of culture there, but they really come to bear over in the values and the behaviors that people show. So it's kind of like, here's what we do, but here's how we go about doing it is even more important from a cultural standpoint. Very often organizations will set systems that reward employees and put those in place who hit goals on the what side of things, but do less so on the how side. I would also say that extends into some practices like recruitment and selection, even how they grow people. It's very important that culture lives in all of those areas. I'm sure you've all heard the saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And it's absolutely true that if you want to be able to hit organizational goals, culture and your cultural strategy is equally as important as your business priorities. So there are several actions that organizations and leaders can take. Let's take a look at a few of them on the next slide. So first would be to define the culture that you want to have, which is, if you don't have it defined and kind of written out for people, the issue is that people really struggle to understand what is that North Star from a cultural side of things. They need to know what's expected of them. And even from a senior leader standpoint, if you're an executive with an organization, it's what are we expecting you to model for the organization and hold people to that. The next is embedding the culture in regular organizational practices. So thinking about the entire employee life cycle and where can it live. Culture should play a significant role across that cycle to ensure that people are seeing it all the time. It's in front of them. They're living and breathing it all the time. And again, that senior leaders are, living embodiments of the culture that you want to see in organization. From a recruitment and selection standpoint, it should both highlight your culture from when you're trying to draw people into an organization, the opportunity is you're starting to think about how could we market our culture and allow people to see what we're all about and on the hows of things, how we go about doing our business and highlighting culture through things like promotions and rewards and recognition. But you really have to think about what's the brand that we want to project into the world from a cultural standpoint. And often, that can start with recruitment and selection. Next is around aligning senior executives with that culture. As I was saying, they have to be living, breathing embodiments of it. And generally speaking, this requires the CEO and the board to hold senior executives to that high watermark. And when it comes to succession planning and aligning with an organizational culture, it really should be part of the measurement criteria that's used to say, how are we going to move people around the organization or up into the organization? And finally, or second last, is thinking about deploying a cultural pulse check, which is really having a measurement, a means to measure how you're doing against culture. As I said earlier, culture is hard to manage because it's this ethereal thing that you can't kind of see and touch as easily as some other things, but making sure that you're always tapping in and using cultural surveys that can be shared and looking at how your initiative measuring up to what you're expecting and sharing those results with others, very important part of it. And finally, on this one is to recognize and reward culture champions. I'll share an example with an organization that did this quite well. So there was an international manufacturing organization in the auto sector that wanted to shift more towards a culture of growing talent. They almost saw that as being an HR responsibility. Like if you want to take courses or you want to grow, go over there, call HR. And I know lots of clients who we work with, the culture is the same there. And they wanted to move that. And so what they did is they knew they had people in the organization who were natural talent and career developers. The structure wasn't there within the organization, but people were just doing this based on their own experience and what it was able to give them and their teams. So they started to build a committee that included these kinds of leaders and included others who are high potentials, but really had that career and that talent growth side of things on top of their mind. And they used a series of forums and smaller workshops to help to shape the culture and define it and to grow within that team. And they deployed them out to start to carry forward some of these workshops around talent development and growth. And by enlisting this group, who were really well-respected people within the organization, there was a group of up-and-comers, natural talent developers, captains of industry. It really created a wave of momentum towards the culture that they wanted to achieve, which is, part of what we do as a regular part of business is to grow our people. So I've got a question for you, Kim. I'll send it back to you now in a second. In terms of retention priorities, employees generally rank career pathing as one of their top items, even if it's not something where they say, I need to know where I'm going. It's I want to grow into something and I want that my career to be enhanced. And one interesting thing is that the shifts over time, as we're seeing, as I mentioned earlier, a lot more Gen Zs coming into the marketplace. People are starting to view career more as a lattice work as opposed to a ladder where they can move diagonally or across or even down and up into other parts of the organization. But they have said consistently it's very important for them. So if this is a key priority for employees who are saying, grow me and I'll stay with you in the organization, why are employees' career expectations not being met?
Great question, Greg. And it's interesting. There was a comment in the chat that somebody already asked the same question. Why is there a big disconnect between what senior leaders see and what employees expect. And I think there's a few things at play, and the research would show there is quite a big disconnect around that. And I think there's a few things. One is we're making the assumptions that a Gen Z or Gen Y or Boomer wants something different in their careers, and they might or they might not. But I think part of the problem is nobody's asking people what they saw actually important to them in their careers. So that's kind of the first piece. I think you've already mentioned it, is leaders aren't necessarily seeing it as their accountability to have the conversation around what's important to people. And I think it's also important to say, what is it that organizations could be doing? And it's funny because I really think of it in the context of what's the impact on the business. HR professionals on this call all know developing peoples, developing leaders is really key to driving and engagement. That is really going to impact your overall business success. And I use the example, I was working with a global accounting firm and working with the senior partners, and they weren't buying into the importance of a career conversation. It's like, yeah, I got where I was and I didn't have any career conversation. Like, why do I need to have that? So I asked them, I said, so tell me, what would make your top 3 performers on your team leave? And there was silence in the room. It's like, well, I don't actually know. Okay, if they crossed the street and went to your biggest competitor, what would be the impact on your financials of your business? What would be the impact on the morale? And then what would be the impact on the organization as a whole? So if you think of it more broadly, even if you take it away from the individual and the impact on the business, is they didn't have the answer to what would make their top 3 performers leave. So what that tells me is nobody's having the conversation. We're assuming what got me here is what's going to motivate everybody else to get to the position I'm in, which is a false assumption. 2, we don't actually know what's motivating or driving them, which is a problem. And 3, that we need to have the conversations with people. And my theory is it's better to have a bad career conversation than no conversation. So start having those conversations. And even if you don't have all the answers, start finding out what's important to people. Because if we make the assumption that they're going to have the same motivations and drive as me, we're never going to get to where we need to. So to me, those are some of those big gaps. So I call it the ROI of talent investment. We all know as HR professionals, all those things impact our ROI and really impact our ability as an organization. So even if we get 2% more engagement of every employee we've had a career conversation with or developed, what is the financial impact on the business? And I think sometimes people underestimate the cost of not having that conversation. So I think I've answered your question there, Greg.
Yeah, very true. I like that point around it's better to have a bad conversation than no conversation, because again, it goes back to how do you flex that muscle within the organization? People will get better at it. It just has to take place.
Yeah. So I want to ask a poll. There's a question in here, but I'm going to ask a poll first to get other people's feedback in terms of, and I'll get Laura to launch this poll here to get people. So who do you think is accountable for career planning in organizations? So let's see what everybody on the call has in terms of point of view of this. So is it the employees' accountability, the leaders, the organization, all of the above? What's your point of view? Let's see. Nothing coming up so far, Laura. I don't know if you've launched it. Okay, here it comes. So 4% so far think it's an employee's responsibility. 6% thinks it's a leader's, and 0 on organization, and 89% all of the above. Wow. I think I like your answer, and the research would actually show it. It's interesting. We were doing a program with one of the big financial institutions in Canada, and they're looking at their high performers and what they were going to do to drive engagement. And they thought the biggest answer of driving that engagement was, we'll just give them an international assignment because that's what everybody wants. So they put all of these top performers in this program to go internationally and said, hey, look at what we've signed you up for to go to an international placement. And all but one turned it down. And these senior leaders in the organization said, what the heck? I'm not sure that was the language that was used. We've given you this great opportunity and you've turned it down. Well, what they didn't bother to ask is what's important for their career development. There was 2 income families. People were established in their communities. They had children where they were, and that wasn't their driver or motivator for career development. So really what it was is we had this scenario where the organization said, well, we're giving you something, so this is great and you should be happy, without actually having the other components involved. So really looking at the employees obviously need to own their career. Leaders need to enable it by having those conversations we've already talked about. And organizations need to put programs in place, but not one program. We need to have programs that are a little bit more flexible, that fit variety of directions, engagements, and importance for everybody. So all of the above from the research and our experience working with organizations would be aligned to that. So this is kind of how we look at it from a shared accountability. We know individual employees own their career. They need to be proactive. They can't sit around and wait for the tap on the shoulder for their manager or the organization to reward them or promote them. They need to speak up. And my theory is if you don't tell your boss or mentor or somebody what you really want to do with your career, they're not going to be able to help you get there. And then looking at it from a manager perspective, what's their role in all of this? Having those conversations we talked about, even if they're not great ones, thinking about understanding the motivators and drivers of everyone on their team. And from an organization perspective, what are those systems and capabilities you put in place? We know that career development isn't necessarily the formal educational model. We know it could be mentoring. We know it's stretch assignments. It's exposure to more senior people in the organization. So we know that career development isn't, and career success isn't going up the proverbial ladder. I think Greg already mentioned the more of the lattice. I kind of think of it as monkey bars, maybe going up sometimes, down sometimes, across sometimes. It's different from everybody. But I think what really needs to happen if you want to see success in an organization is having all three elements working at the same time versus, I call it the push-pull, everybody's working together to achieve the same results. So I think that's really important. So I think everybody on the call saw the value of all of those components to it. So I'd like to open up the chat and see what you have done in your organization to engage or retain talent. Love to see some comments in the Q&A if you'd like to post them out there.
Yeah, there's a comment here from Barb. So I had an employee say that she never knew she could ask for a raise. She's older and that's how things used to be. Make sure people know to speak up. I think that is a great point because it goes back to creating a two-way conversation between leaders and their people, especially if you can do that in a dynamic, regular type of frequency. Those kinds of things, the undiscussables of things like raises or a person's value to an organization, and those will more come up if you're having those kinds of conversations. Great comment, Barb.
Thanks, Greg. There's a comment here from somebody saying conducting stay interviews. Yeah, unfortunately, sometimes we wait till somebody leaves before we actually understand what was important to them, which is really a little bit too late. So conducting stay interviews is a great strategy to understand what's driving engagement and retention. Thank you for sharing. Other thoughts or comments around what you're doing to engage and retain talent? Maybe you want to just add it to the chat?
There was a good question here, Kim, on how do performance reviews tie into employee satisfaction. I can definitely make a comment here. If for organizations that don't have these kinds of conversations, what it does is creates a vacuum of information, right? When it comes to either of people's performance, that retrospective look, so how are they measuring up, or where they're going in an organization, and it definitely has a deflating impact on employees' engagement. So looking at both sides of things, people first want to know where they stand. How am I measuring up and how am I doing, and where can I grow or where can I improve? And also, what are the opportunities that are available to me? All very important topics when it comes to engagement and obviously retention.
Great. Let's see. Promote internal moves, deploy career navigator, and improve learning resources. I would agree that was from Jeannie on terms of what she's doing for driving engagement retention. Internal moves, it's interesting if we look at the traditional view of the talent hoarding, which will probably get stronger as the scarce resources in terms of mobility in the organization. I think that's a great message around your brand and your culture when you encourage internal mobility. And I would encourage sharing that news through some formal communication channel to say, you know, Mary moved from marketing to finance or whatever. This senior leader had a very non-traditional move. Showcasing some of the moves really highlights that's a cultural acceptable thing to do. I think that's great. And then helping people navigate. I don't know what career navigator means, but helping people navigate their careers through some kind of portal or resources where they can navigate their strengths, weaknesses, assess. You know, I think sometimes one of the challenges I find from an employee's perspective is they underestimate their value of their brand in an organization, and really understanding how I perceive myself, is that consistent with my colleagues and my manager? And sometimes there's a big disconnect, and that sometimes impacts our career opportunities in an organization. So I really do like that. Improving learning resources is a great recommendation as well. So here's a comment. Oh, go ahead, Greg. You're going to answer one of them?
Yeah, there was a really good question here, which is the person had found that as much as we describe career development as a lattice work, as we've mentioned, say millennials still want promotion. So they really want to see themselves get ahead in some tangible way. How do you overcome these unrealistic expectations? Assuming that someone, you hear the thing around millennials that they want to become CEO tomorrow, or they feel this expectation that they should be CEO tomorrow. Any thoughts on that, Kim?
And it's a great question, and it's a common challenge people have in an organization. And I think sometimes it's important for a couple things to understand is, what is it about the promotion that's driving that request? Is it money? Is it status? Is it opportunity? And so sometimes digging underneath it helps understand where we need to drive some motivation and engagement with the individual. Sometimes it's back to my comment around brand, is if I say, I think I'm ready as a new employee with 2 years experience to be the CEO, tell me what about those experiences thinks you're ready to be a CEO, and show me an example as to what makes you credible and ready. And part of that sometimes is talking about not jobs people need to hold to get to that next level, but what are the experiences we expect people to have? What are those experiences they need to showcase? Is it managing projects? Is it managing P&L? Is it managing people? Is it running large global initiatives? What are those things we expect people to do to be able to set more realistic? When they're not able to demonstrate some of those expectations, it makes a little bit more reality around that, around here's what the organization sees your level or capability. So making some alignment, getting them some opportunities and exposure to other people that are more senior helps them understand really where their skills lie and capability, maybe where those developmental opportunities exist.
Yeah. Great comment, Kim. There was a few comments here on mentoring that I think align to that. I would add too that sometimes that very question of people expecting to be promoted can sometimes be one of the barriers for leaders to have those conversations, because they say, if I have a career conversation, it might create an expectation that someone feels like they should be promoted right away. And what we'd say is, first off, you definitely want to have the conversation and be realistic about, a leader can be honest and say, there's nothing right now, but things change and things develop. So let's get a development plan in place and start growing you towards something, whatever those things may be. As you said, Kim, what are those experiences you need to have that will get you ready for what's next?
Yeah. I was just reading one of the comments here from Josie. Prioritize a new job within the org and internal applicants when there's a new job opening. And I think this is a disconnect that I see in organization. We've got 3 functional groups working on it. We've got employee relations potentially letting people go. We've got talent development identifying skills gap in the organization. And then we've got talent acquisition working on filling roles. And sometimes those 3 functional groups aren't talking to see how we can create that internal mobility. So creating some kind of system infrastructure portal where you track people's skills and capability helps address some of that. But I do sometimes find those 3 functional groups aren't talking within one organization to make sure they understand each other's needs and may be able to fill that need internally versus letting somebody go. And if you think about that skills gap, every organizations are finding the strain of great resignation or whatever. How are we actually looking at our internal talent to potentially fill that role and maybe drive some engagement with those individuals?
And
Nice
it's
comment.
obviously, it's very expensive to be going externally all the time to a certain degree, although strategically you might want to do that here and there, but growing people organically gives people that viewpoint that yes, you can, there is progressions within the organization, and tends to bring up engagement.
Great. So if there's a few around internal mobility I see on here. Created a new team called Employee Engagement Coordinators who specifically are there to help employees. Great concept. This is kind of like Greg's concept around cultural champions, engagement champions. And I think, anytime you can create engagement champions in the organization that are not HR and not at the top of the house, you create more buy-in, because it's not feel like it's a top-down or HR-driven initiative. I really like that concept. I haven't heard that before, but I think it's a really good concept.
Yeah, definitely. So Kim, and all great comments in here. I'm seeing more around mentorships and reverse mentorships as well. Really key in terms of engaging and retaining talent. Is there anything else, Kim, that you'd say leaders can do to re-engage employees and improve on that disconnect, that gap that we were seeing earlier?
Sure, I'll share a few thoughts that I think some of them have come up across. A lot of the messages in the chat have already been addressed, but I'm going to come back to them and give some examples. The culture of lifelong learning and development starts with senior leaders. And Greg, you talked about the concept of lifelong learning, but what does that look like? And I use the example of an organization. They were wanting to run out, trying to change some culture around learning. But I asked all of the senior leaders at that table, how many of you are getting development right now? How many of you have coaches? How many of you have been through training in the last year or 24 months? Not a single person on that team has. So what's that message we're sharing if no one at the top of the house is doing any learning and development and growing along the way? I think that's a never-ending process, but I think it starts at the top in terms of setting that message. Formalize a system of internal mobility to create opportunities that will inspire people to reskill, upskill. And I think many people in the chat commented about that, is trying to create internal mobility. It is great in terms of maintaining and retaining that institutional knowledge. It's great in driving engagement. It's great optics for your organization to say, look, we're looking to develop people internally and giving people opportunities. And I've seen organizations roll that out and that's kind of an enterprise-wide solution that can really create some good momentum in the organization. We've talked about the importance of having active career conversations. I've actually seen organizations kind of push that behavior by actually making that one of the measurements of leaders' bonus opportunity. So one of the components on their bonus is, have you had career conversations with each one of your direct reports? And that's one of the criteria required to achieve their full bonus. And it might seem radical to some on the call, but I've actually seen it create that real huge behavior change around making the time to have the career conversation. And then building a career lattice for your people. One of the things that I would recommend everyone on the call, if you haven't already done that, is define what career success looks like in your organization. If you're a salesperson and selling one more thing or three more things, you're getting rewarded through money. But what happens if you're not in a role where selling something's required? You're in a finance role, a marketing role, an operations role. What does career success look like in your organization? Defining it so people know. When we think about inspirational leaders, people can identify how your work is contributing to the better good, as Greg mentioned. And make sure employees know that there's shared responsibility of careers. I know there is organizations that are very paternal, and really the employees are waiting for someone to give them that good old tap on the shoulders, really making sure it's clear that they own their careers and they need to own their development. So a combination of those, or all of those, are great ways to get started in improving engagement and retention in terms of my experiences through the research we've seen and organizations we've worked with. Anything you'd add to that, Greg?
Yeah, well, there was a good comment from Barb, which was around, I guess, career mobility within an organization. She was saying that if someone wants to go outside of their division, they're very active, help and support a person moving around their organization. I think one of the things that I've I've noticed can be a barrier there. I think you mentioned earlier, Kim, is talent hoarding, right? Where people say, my team is strong, I want to keep them, and you need to change mindsets on that with organizations that do have that kind of culture. And usually that is around the thought of like, what would it do for you if you were to be able to see a person go from your division into another part of the organization versus out of the organization if they leave? And obviously there's a lot of positive to that. If the person was great here and they're going to an adjacent department, it's going to be fantastic because you're going to see strength on each side. It's like the chain of process across an organization. You want all those links to be equally strong, and people staying within the organization help you in that kind of way. And the people who are true talent advocates think about mobility and wanting to get people to be successful in role and then move on and bring in a new group of people within their part of their division. So a really great comment from Barbara.
Well, and I think that's an interesting point. If you think about the competency of great leaders today, and every organization defines them differently, but your ability to develop and grow talent should be one of the top priorities in an organization's competencies. Is what are you doing to develop and grow our people? And back to the question around people still want that promotion when they're new to the organization or very junior in their career. Well, if you use the organization as a pretty small organization, pretty flat, going up the ladder isn't really an option if you only have 4 levels in your organization. So going across and developing in other ways is really key. But one of the things that I would add to this, but I probably should have put on this list, is internal networking. People spend a lot of time saying that they want things, but they're not out there talking to do that internal networking. What's the skills in demand in my industry, my organization, my environment? Could be within my vertical of marketing even. What are the skills in demand? Get out there and talk to people and really find out what's important and where do you need to spend some time and energy in terms of developing your own career. So those are really good comments.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that comment, Kim, I hear a lot about creating visibility for people within an organization tied to networking, which is more like allowing people to take center stage in a certain initiative where a leader might step back and kind of lead a project from within and allow some of their people who they would like to see promoted, get some of that visibility, whether they're reporting to the board or they're able to talk with senior leadership. It starts to build comfort that this person is strong and can be effective and at different levels within the organization. But yeah, the networking is definitely key.
Well, and I think it's often that the only time people spend time networking is when they're looking for a new job versus building it into their regular cadence. Monthly is connecting with people. There was a great book written as Never Eat Lunch Alone. There was this concept of, when you go to company events, don't sit with the same people. Don't talk to the same people. Talk to someone you don't know. Talk to somebody in another division. Sit beside somebody at the conference that you've never met. So really forcing yourself out of that bubble that you operate in. And we all get busy in our own jobs in our own world that definitely happens. So it's great to get outside of that box.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a couple comments here. It says, is it possible to consolidate all the responses, comments, and distribute along with the slides? Some great stuff in the chat. So I'll let Laura respond to that, who's helping us run the webcast today. And maybe we can find a way to capture all of the commentary, because I think there's many very experienced HR professionals on here that are doing some great stuff within their own organizations. And it would be really good to be able to share them with everybody else on the call.
Yeah, I believe that can be done. Laura, you can confirm that. But yeah, we'll send the link and the chat as well.
Very good. Any last questions before we sign off? I think we've got a couple minutes left before we sign off. Oh, there's a new message. Oh, it's one of the participants saying you can copy and paste it yourself to keep a track of it. Thank you. Yeah. That's great to know. So love to have your feedback on this, and love to see what other topics are of interest to you. We've had lots of interest on this topic, and lots of customers and organizations have reached out on this. So I'd love to know if there's any other topics of interest. You can put them in the chat. We will distribute the recording afterwards. I think it's including, Laura can pull the chat for us as well. But I'd love to know if there's any other questions before we sign off.
I think there's going to be a survey sent out afterwards as well. Kim, would love to hear your feedback on the session, what you liked, and if there's any suggestions on topics for the future, you can include it there. But really appreciate your time today. It is an interesting topic. It's very timely, but it's good to chat with you on this.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you all for attending today. It was great to see you all. And on this last slide, Greg and I both have our email address. If you have any quick questions you want to ask us, please reach out. We're happy to answer any questions about us, about LHH, or about the work that we do with organizations globally or locally.